Best of January, 10 Scary Stories. Story number 1, The Echoing Hollow Doctor. Samuel Carter was never one for superstition. A scientist by trade, he had spent his career studying sound frequencies, waveforms, and the quiet hums that reverberated through the natural world. When the opportunity came to take a sabbatical in a small, isolated town in New England, he welcomed it. The town of Havenwood was the perfect place to focus. No distractions, no bustling city life, just peace and quiet. At first, the town seemed like a dream. It sat nestled in the shadow of a dense forest, the trees towering like ancient sentinels around the few houses that dotted the landscape. The air was crisp, the kind of silence that made Samuel feel like he could hear his thoughts more clearly. He rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, overlooking the forest. His plan was simple: spend his time in the quiet, conduct his research, and return to the world with new insights. But it didn't take long for him to notice something strange. It began one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills and the last remnants of daylight faded. He had been sitting at his desk, reviewing recordings of various natural frequencies when he heard it. A low hum, distant at first, almost imperceptible. Samuel sat up, leaned toward the window, and strained his ears. The sound seemed to be coming from the forest. He frowned. It wasn't an animal noise or the wind. It was rhythmic, like the whisper of a voice, but muffled, swallowed by the trees. Curious, he grabbed his equipment and headed outside. He stood at the edge of the forest, listening, but the hum had stopped. For the next few days, the sound persisted, always in the same place. Samuel thought little of it. He was studying the vibrations of the natural world, after all. Perhaps it was the wind, or some phenomenon he hadn't accounted for. But the more he listened, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just a sound, it was like a voice, one that seemed to call to him. One night, unable to sleep, Samuel decided to venture into the woods. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the cold air. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the ground. The forest was silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves underfoot. As he walked deeper, the hum began again, louder now, as if guiding him. He pushed through the trees, following the sound. His mind raced with scientific theories. Perhaps there was some geological activity, a fault line beneath the ground, or electromagnetic interference. But the closer he got, the more the sound morphed, growing darker, more insistent. Then, suddenly, the hum stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Samuel stood still, trying to make sense of it. But just as he turned to leave, he heard it, a voice. Soft at first, like a whisper caught in the wind. It called his name. Samuel. His heart skipped a beat. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the forest. It was something else. Something alive, something aware of him. Samuel, come closer. He froze. The voice seemed to echo from the very depths of the forest, drawing him in, pulling him toward something. His rational mind screamed at him to turn back, to return to the safety of his cabin. But something, some compulsion, urged him forward. He walked deeper into the woods, each step heavy, each breath colder than the last. As he moved, the voice grew louder, clearer, and began to change. It wasn't just calling his name anymore, it was speaking to him, as though it knew his darkest thoughts. "You're alone," the voice said. "You've always been alone." His breath caught in his throat. He stopped, looking around. The forest seemed to close in on him. The trees loomed, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers. No one can hear you. No one cares. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. His mind raced. This wasn't just a voice. It was his own voice, echoing back to him. The thoughts he had kept buried, the doubts, the loneliness, the fears. They were coming from the forest, from the very air around him. "You'll never escape it," the voice whispered. "You'll never be free." His skin prickled with dread. He turned to leave, but his legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. The voice continued, growing louder, more insistent, more personal. "What if it's true? What if no one cares about you? What if you're the one who's broken?" The sound twisted around him, a cacophony of his own self-doubt, his insecurities laid bare by some force he couldn't understand. His mind began to unravel, his thoughts blurring together, each echo more accusatory than the last. He screamed, but the voice only laughed, a hollow, mocking sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Samuel fell to his knees, his breath shallow, his body trembling, and then, as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The forest was silent again. Samuel stood there, gasping for air, his mind reeling. What had just happened? Was it real? Was he losing his grip on reality? Or was there something in the woods? Something ancient? Something that knew him better than he knew himself? The walk back to his cabin was a blur. When he arrived, he bolted the door and locked all the windows, but the echoes of that voice lingered. They followed him into his dreams, taunting him, whispering that he wasn't alone, that the forest was always watching. In the days that followed, the hum returned, but it was different now. It was a part of him, woven into his very thoughts. He couldn't escape it. It had him, body and soul. And as January's chill began to settle in, Dr. Samuel Carter realized the truth. The forest wasn't just calling to him. It was inside him now. The echoes of his darkest thoughts had found a home, and they would never leave. He had never been alone. Story number 2. Through the Ashen dawn. The house had been abandoned for decades, its once proud structure now crumbling under the weight of time. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging in places, and ivy crawled along the walls like tendrils of some long-forgotten memory. It seemed like the perfect place for Thomas Winters to escape. After the sudden, violent death of his wife Emma and their 2 young children in a car crash, Thomas had been left with nothing but grief and guilt. His mind had shattered in the aftermath, and every day felt like an unbearable weight pressing against his chest. The world outside had become too much, too loud, too bright, too full of people who couldn't understand. So, he fled to the only place that seemed to offer some solace: his family's old estate, a house that had been passed down through generations, though its history was filled with more shadows than sunlight. No one had lived there for years. It had been his grandparents' house and then his parents', before they too had left it behind. There was something unsettling about it, even back then. But grief had a way of distorting reality, making the past seem distant and inconsequential. All Thomas wanted now was silence. He arrived in the small, fog-covered town just before the turn of the year, driving the rusted old car he had inherited after the accident. The landscape felt familiar, but wrong. The air was heavy, thick with something unspeakable. He didn't know it then, but it was the land itself, the earth that had soaked up centuries of forgotten blood, and it was waiting for him. The house stood on a hill at the edge of the town, like a monument to a forgotten era. Inside, the air smelled of mold and decay, but it was quiet. Thomas took it all in. Dusty furniture covered in white sheets, broken picture frames, and the faint scent of something old, something ancient. He didn't want to be alone, not really, but it was better than the alternative. He set up his things in the small bedroom upstairs, the one his father had once used. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and the walls seemed to whisper, though he couldn't understand the words. But that didn't matter. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in anything anymore. The first night, he sat by the fireplace in the cold living room, staring at the flames as they flickered and died. His mind was a blur, images of his family, his beautiful Emma, their 2 young children, Anna and Ben, haunted him with every breath. He couldn't escape the thoughts. He couldn't escape the memory of that day. He had been in the car with them, but he had survived. He had been the only one. The guilt was suffocating. He had been too tired, too distracted, and now his entire world was ashes. His family was gone, and he was left with nothing but this crumbling house and his endless grief. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the arrival of the new year, something changed. The house seemed to groan under the weight of time, and Thomas felt an unsettling shiver crawl down his spine. The air grew colder, sharper. He looked around the room, the shadows deepening, the corners of his vision distorting. A sound came from the walls, soft at first, like the whisper of a breeze through the trees. But then it grew louder, more insistent, like someone was speaking to him. Thomas. His heart skipped a beat. He stood, his legs unsteady, the room spinning around him. The voice was faint but clear. It wasn't his imagination. It couldn't be. He moved toward the source of the sound, toward the hallway. The voice seemed to be calling him from the darkness, coaxing him forward, urging him to listen. "Thomas," it whispered again, louder this time, but with a note of anger. "You have come home, but you should not have come." Thomas felt a wave of cold rush over him, and suddenly he was not alone. The house itself seemed to shift, its walls closing in, the air thick with the smell of earth and rot. The whisper grew louder, more frantic, until it was no longer a whisper at all, but a scream, a shriek of agony that echoed through every room. "You cannot escape, Thomas. You cannot run from what you have done." He stumbled back, fear clawing at his throat. His mind raced, and for a moment he thought he might lose himself completely. But then something inside him snapped. He was angry now, angry at the voices, at the house, at the curse that had brought him here. "No," he shouted, his voice raw with grief. "I didn't kill them. I didn't do this." But the house did not answer. The shadows seemed to move, writhing like living things. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the very walls seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, one that had lain dormant for years. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hallway slammed open, and Thomas saw it. An ancient figure, draped in tattered robes, its face obscured by a hood. Its hands, gnarled and twisted, reached out toward him. The figure spoke in a voice that was not a voice, but a rumbling, like the earth itself groaning in pain. "You have come to pay the price," it said, its words like thunder. "The land remembers your sins, Thomas Winters. It remembers the blood that has been spilled." The figure stepped forward, and the temperature in the room dropped, the air heavy with a sense of impending doom. The house, the land, was alive with vengeance, a vengeance that had been festering for generations. And now it had found him. Thomas fell to his knees, his breath ragged, his chest tight with terror. He realized too late that he had been chosen, that the land had called him back to settle a debt, one that had been left unpaid for too long. The curse was not of his making, but it had latched onto him, the grief in his heart and the guilt in his soul, a perfect vessel for the ancient wrath that now sought to claim him. The figure loomed over him, its voice low and filled with malice. The balance must be restored. The blood that was spilled must be avenged. Thomas's mind raced. He had heard stories as a child, whispers about the land's history, about the old deeds done on the soil of this cursed house. It was said that generations before his family had come here, the land had soaked up blood, the blood of a long-forgotten betrayal, and now that blood demanded a price, a reckoning. "I didn't kill them," Thomas whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't." But the figure shook its head slowly, the movement like the creaking of an old tree. "You are guilty, Thomas Winters. You are guilty of being the last to carry the curse. You are guilty of surviving what others could not." Suddenly, the shadows around him seemed to close in, twisting and contorting, like they were trying to swallow him whole. The floor beneath him cracked, the ceiling groaned as if the house itself was alive, shifting with purpose. Thomas's thoughts became a blur. His family's faces, their smiles, their voices. They all faded into darkness, replaced by the cold presence of the ancient force that now towered over him. The air became suffocating, thick with the stench of decay, and he gasped for breath, his chest tight, his heart racing. The figure raised one hand, and in the eerie silence that followed, Thomas could feel something pulling at him, tugging at his very soul. I can't die like this," Thomas choked out, his voice breaking. "I didn't want this. I didn't ask for this." The figure's voice was like the earth cracking open. "It matters not. You have come to the place where all debts are paid, and you will pay for what you have taken." The house seemed to pulse around him as the figure stepped closer, and the ground beneath Thomas's feet buckled. For a moment, he thought the very world was collapsing, the walls crashing in, the foundation shaking like it was going to swallow him whole. And then, with a final, chilling whisper, the figure spoke. "Through the ashes of your grief, you will rise, but not as you once were." In that moment, Thomas felt something snap within him, something ancient, something powerful. A wave of pain washed over him, and then all went dark. When he awoke, it was the new year. The house was silent. The air was still. But something was different. The land that had once been cursed now felt as though it had been cleansed, its ancient thirst sated. Thomas could feel it deep within him. Something had been taken, something had been returned. He stumbled to his feet, gasping, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the ordeal. He was no longer alone in the house, but the voices were quiet now, just echoes in the distance. As the first rays of the New Year's sun touched the earth, Thomas looked out of the window, staring at the horizon. He was free, but at a cost. The land had taken what it needed, and Thomas Winters, now bound to the very soil that had claimed his family, would forever bear the weight of its ancient vengeance. Story number 3. The Pale Stranger. It had been 10 years since Michael Cole had last stepped foot in his childhood home. He had returned from the war, the endless years of violence and bloodshed a distant echo in his mind, though the weight of those memories still hung heavy in his chest. The house was supposed to be a refuge, a place to heal, to find some semblance of normalcy. The home on the edge of town, weathered by time, was where he had grown up. The place where his mother had raised him after his father's sudden death when he was a boy. The town hadn't changed much, though it felt smaller now. The streets, once bustling with life, seemed to have grown quieter. The house sat at the end of a narrow, tree-lined road. Its exterior faded and cracked, but still standing, as if it had waited for his return. The old oak tree out front, which he had climbed as a child, now loomed larger than he remembered. It felt like a sign, an anchor in the storm of his thoughts. He parked his car in the cracked driveway and took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The door creaked open with a familiar groan as he stepped inside. The air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and something older, like the remnants of a long-forgotten memory. He hadn't been here since his mother's death. The house had sat empty ever since. At first, it seemed like the place he had once known. The same creaking floorboards, the same worn leather couch in the living room. But there was something off, something out of place, as though the house itself had changed in his absence. The walls seemed to press in on him, the silence too heavy. His mind had been filled with visions of peace, but now there was an unease, a tension he couldn't shake. The first night was uneventful, just the loneliness of an empty house wrapping around him like an old, uncomfortable blanket. He slept fitfully, the weight of the past lingering over him, the memories of his time in the war occasionally surfacing in fragmented flashes. He awoke in a cold sweat more than once, but he attributed it to his unsettled state. Nothing more. The next day, he explored the house, cleaning out old boxes and sifting through the remnants of his mother's life. It was on the third day that he noticed something strange, an unfamiliar scent wafting from the attic. It was faint but distinct, like something old, like rotting wood and mildew, but underneath it, something else, something more primal. He had never noticed it before, but now it seemed impossible to ignore. Driven by a mix of curiosity and unease, he decided to investigate. He climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, the wood creaking under his weight. The air up there was thick, filled with dust motes that danced lazily in the slivers of light streaming through the small window. There, in the far corner of the room, he saw it. A mattress on the floor, blankets strewn carelessly around it. And sitting on the mattress, staring at him with wide, hollow eyes, was a man. The man was pale, almost sickly looking, with a gaunt face and disheveled hair. He wore ragged clothes, and his presence, though still, felt almost too present, too alive. The stranger didn't say a word. He simply sat there, his eyes locked on Michael as if waiting for something, as if he had been there for an eternity, just waiting for him. For a moment, Michael stood frozen in the doorway, his mind racing. Who was this man? What was he doing here? He didn't remember anyone ever living in the attic, certainly not since his mother had passed. The stranger's stillness made him uneasy, but he forced himself to speak. "Who are you?" Michael asked, his voice thick with confusion. The man didn't answer at first. Instead, he smiled. A slow, almost imperceptible curling of his lips. His eyes didn't change, though. They remained cold and distant, like he was staring through Michael rather than at him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man spoke in a voice that sounded as though it came from far away, a voice that was both familiar and strange. "I've always been here," he said, his tone hollow, as if the words themselves were ghosts. Michael felt a chill run through him. He had no memory of this man, no recollection of him ever being in the house. Yet, there was something about him, something familiar in the way he spoke, the way his eyes bore into Michael's soul. "I don't know who you are," Michael said, his voice trembling now. "This is my home." The man simply nodded, his gaze never wavering. "It's been your home, but it's mine now, too." Michael felt the words settling into his mind, twisting, contorting. It was as though the stranger was inside his head, reshaping his thoughts, distorting his memories. He tried to shake it off, but the more he looked at the man, the more his grip on reality began to slip. Days passed, and Michael couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. The man, though he never moved or spoke much, seemed to be everywhere, always just at the edge of his sight, lurking in the background, as if he had always been there, a part of the house, a part of the memories that Michael had buried. As time went on, Michael's perception of the house and of his own memories began to warp. He found himself forgetting things. The time he spent with his mother, the way the house used to smell, the way it used to feel. The stranger's presence seemed to bleed into everything, distorting his sense of self. Was he remembering things, or was he simply imagining them? Was the house really the same as it had been, or was it a place he no longer recognized? The man never spoke much, but when he did, his words haunted Michael. "You've always been alone," he would say, or "This house doesn't want you here." Soon, the lines between memory and reality blurred entirely. Michael couldn't tell if the memories he had of his family, of his life before the war, were true, or if they had been altered somehow, twisted by the man in the attic. His own face began to seem unfamiliar in the mirror, as though the stranger's presence had infected his very soul. One night, after hours of pacing, Michael ventured back into the attic. The man was there, as always, but this time something was different. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Michael approached the mattress, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking with desperation. "What do you want from me?" The man smiled again, that same hollow, empty grin. "I want what you owe," he said softly. Michael's mind swirled. What did he owe? What was happening? The room around him began to spin, the walls closing in, and in that moment he realized he wasn't alone in this house. The man had been here all along, and now so had Michael. The house had claimed him. The stranger was not merely living in the attic. He had always been there, buried deep in the foundation of the house, a part of its memory. And now, so was Michael. And as the house shifted, as the walls seemed to pulse with some ancient energy, Michael finally understood. He had never really left. He had always been here, a part of the house's dark, twisted history. The stranger had merely reminded him of that. The attic door creaked shut, and Michael was lost, trapped forever in the echoing darkness, where memories and reality no longer held any meaning. Story number 4. The Last Visit. Dr. Thomas Avery had never truly believed in curses. After all, he had spent his life as an archaeologist, uncovering the lost secrets of ancient civilizations and studying the artifacts of long-dead peoples. Curses, he thought, were the stuff of myth, something to entertain the gullible and the superstitious, not something that could affect a man of reason and science like him. But as he stood at the gates of the estate that had once been his childhood home, he felt an unease settle deep in his bones. It had been over 20 years since he had last set foot on the land, since his family had moved away after his father's sudden death. The house, a sprawling Victorian manor, looked the same, or at least the same as it had in his memories. But something about it felt different now, as if the house itself was waiting for him, as if it knew he was coming. The estate had been passed down through generations of Averys, each one a silent witness to the passage of time, each one with their own unspoken secrets. Thomas had left the house long ago, seeking knowledge, seeking answers beyond the confines of family tradition. He had never once looked back, not after his father's death, and certainly not after the strange, whispered rumors about the family's history had reached his ears. There were things, dark things, that had been buried deep within the walls of that house, things even his father had refused to speak of. But now, with his career winding down, Thomas felt an overwhelming need to return, to understand what had been hidden, to uncover what had been left behind. The house was silent when he entered. Dust motes drifted in the dim light that filtered through the drawn curtains. The familiar smell of old wood and leather filled the air, but there was something else, a scent that he couldn't quite place. It was as though the house had been waiting for him, holding its breath. Thomas made his way through the hallways, each step echoing in the stillness, until he reached his father's study. The study had always been his father's domain, an impenetrable fortress of books, maps, and dusty tomes. Thomas had spent many hours there as a child, sitting in the corner and watching his father work, feeling the weight of knowledge and history pressing down on him. But now, as an adult, the study felt wrong. The air was thick with something that wasn't just dust. Something else lingered in the shadows. His eyes were drawn to a heavy wooden desk at the far end of the room, and there, sitting on the desk, was a journal. It was old, its leather cover cracked and worn, and its pages yellowed with age. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen this journal before. It wasn't his father's handwriting. No, this was something else, something older, something darker. He reached for the journal, his fingers trembling as he opened it to the first page. The ink was faded but still legible, and as he began to read, a chill crept up his spine. The journal belonged to his great-grandfather, Edmund Avery, a man who had been notorious for his eccentricities. Edmund had been an archaeologist as well, though his interests were much more unconventional. He had spent years traveling to distant lands, delving into forgotten tombs and seeking knowledge that no one else dared to touch. But it was the final years of Edmund's life that were shrouded in mystery. His journal detailed strange symbols, ancient rituals, and references to a lost civilization, one that had never been documented by any other historian or archaeologist. The further Thomas read, the more he felt the weight of the words pulling him in. His great-grandfather had uncovered something so powerful, so terrible, that it had consumed him. It was a knowledge too dangerous to be passed down, too dark to be shared with anyone. Edmund's last entries were frantic, filled with warnings about a presence, something ancient and malevolent, that had followed him back from his travels. The entries spoke of rituals, of sacrifices, and of a curse that had been placed upon the Avery family. Thomas continued to read, each word drawing him deeper into a world he had never imagined. As he deciphered the cryptic symbols, the strange language, a horrible realization began to dawn on him. His great-grandfather had not just discovered this knowledge, he had become a part of it. He had awakened something that should have remained buried forever. And then, at the very end of the journal, Thomas found the final entry. "The darkness calls to me now. It has taken root in my mind, and I fear it will take root in my soul. The family must carry the burden, for the curse is ours to bear. If you are reading this, you must complete the final rite. Only then will the entity be satisfied and the curse be broken. The last of the Averys must face it. I have failed. You must not." Thomas felt his blood run cold. The words blurred before his eyes, and the room seemed to spin. He could hear something, a faint whisper, a voice calling his name. It was coming from somewhere deep within the house, somewhere he couldn't reach. The presence that his great-grandfather had written about. It was real, and it was waiting for him. As the hours passed, the house seemed to come alive around him. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and strange, unintelligible noises echoed from the dark corners of the rooms. He could feel it now, the weight of something ancient pressing down on him, urging him to complete the ritual, to finish what his great-grandfather had started. He couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't just a family secret. It was a legacy, one that had been passed down through the generations, hidden in plain sight. And as the night stretched on, Thomas knew that he was being drawn deeper into the darkness. He could no longer tell where the house ended and the curse began. The line between reality and madness was blurring, and he could feel the presence growing stronger, closer, until it was almost tangible. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, when the first light of dawn began to break through the curtains, that Thomas understood. He had returned to the house not to escape his past, but to face it, to finish the ritual, to become the final Avery to carry the burden of the curse. And as he opened the final page of the journal, he saw the last unfinished entry, the one that had yet to be written, the one that would complete the curse and bind him to it forever. The last entry. It is yours to write, Thomas. Story number 5. Cold Hands. Rachel hadn't been back to the family estate in over 5 years. Her mother had died suddenly, a stroke that left no time for goodbyes. And now, Rachel was standing at the gates of the old manor that had once been her home. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as she stared up at the looming silhouette of the house. The large iron gates creaked in the wind, and the thick hedges surrounding the property seemed to close in on her. It was as if the house itself was waiting, watching, remembering. She didn't want to be here, not after everything her mother had told her about the house, about the past. But there was no choice now. Rachel had to settle the estate. Her mother had left no will, no clear direction. And despite the distance and the years, this was the place she had to return to. As Rachel drove up the long, winding path to the front door, memories of her childhood flooded her mind. The house was enormous, a sprawling Victorian structure that had always felt more like a prison than a home. It was cold, even in the summer, and always seemed to be holding secrets in its shadowed corners. Her mother had been distant, often withdrawn, and Rachel now realized just how little she had truly understood about her. There had been so many strange things, strange silences, unexplained disappearances, and hushed conversations at night. But Rachel had never thought to ask. She had grown up trying to forget. The house was even darker now, the once pristine garden overrun with weeds. As she entered, the musty scent of old wood and dust hit her, and for the first time, she felt the chill that seemed to seep from the walls, running up her spine like cold fingers. "Mom," Rachel whispered to herself, her voice breaking, but there was no answer. The house seemed empty, lifeless, yet alive in a way she couldn't explain. She placed her bag on the old oak table in the foyer and began to walk through the house, each room familiar yet strange. The silence was almost oppressive. The floorboards creaked under her feet, the sound echoing in the empty hallways. Everything in the house was as it had been when she left, except for the strange cold spots that seemed to appear and disappear, making the air feel thick, like the house was holding its breath. Rachel moved from room to room, trying to push past the overwhelming sense of unease. She had a duty to fulfill, after all. She couldn't afford to let the house's oppressive atmosphere control her. But when she entered her mother's old study, something stopped her. There, on the desk, was a collection of letters, old, yellowed, and tied with a black ribbon. Rachel hesitated, her fingers lingering on the edges of the bundle. She wasn't sure what drew her to them, but she untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters were from her great-grandmother, a woman Rachel had heard very little about. The writing was sharp, almost frantic, with strange references to rituals, dark forces, and promises made in the shadows. Rachel felt a cold shiver run through her as she read about the old ways that had been practiced by her ancestors, ways that had been kept hidden from the rest of the world. There were mentions of sacrifices, rituals performed to keep the family safe, and of someone called the Watcher, an entity that seemed to follow their bloodline. Each letter became darker, more desperate. There were warnings to avoid certain places in the house, to never speak the name of the Watcher aloud, and to never, under any circumstances, go into the basement. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she flipped through the pages, her breath growing short. Her great-grandmother spoke of an ancient pact that had been made, one that tied their family to a power that had always lurked beneath the surface of their existence. And then, the last letter, dated only a few months before her great-grandmother's death, chilled her to the bone. It was filled with rambling thoughts, a woman losing her grip on reality, but the final line was clear. "The Watcher is waking again, Rachel. You are the last of us. You must face it. You must not run." Rachel's mind raced. She couldn't understand it, couldn't process it. But the words haunted her, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. She placed the letters down and stood, the room growing colder, the air thickening. The silence around her deepened, like the house itself was waiting for her next move. The house had never felt like this before. It wasn't just the cold, it was something deeper, something alive. She turned and went down the hall, her footsteps echoing. The further she walked, the colder it became. By the time she reached the back of the house, the cold had become unbearable. She could see her breath, feel the chill seeping into her bones. And that's when she noticed it. A door she had never seen before. It was at the far end of the hallway, behind a faded tapestry, and it led down to the basement. Her heart raced. The basement. The one place her great-grandmother had warned about. The one place her mother had always told her never to go. But now, as Rachel stood before it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling her. The cold seeped from under the door, wrapping around her like an invisible hand. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. It was as if the house itself had grown tired of waiting. With a deep breath, Rachel opened the door. The basement was darker than she remembered, the air thick and stale. The stairs creaked beneath her weight as she descended, each step more painful than the last. The cold grew sharper, more intense, until she felt as though her very bones were freezing. And then she saw it. A large, ancient mirror standing in the corner, covered in dust, its surface reflecting nothing but blackness. It was the coldness that seemed to radiate from the mirror, an overwhelming, suffocating cold that made Rachel's blood run cold. She stepped closer, and for a moment the cold seemed to pulse, to throb like a heartbeat. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the mirror. The reflection wasn't her own. A pale, skeletal hand emerged from the mirror, its long, bony fingers brushing against the glass. And then, a voice, cold and ancient, whispered from within the depths of the mirror. "You should have never come back, Rachel." The voice was familiar. It was her mother's voice. But it was distorted, hollow, as if it had been trapped for years, suffocated by time and the house's dark secrets. Rachel stumbled back, but the mirror didn't fade. Instead, it seemed to grow, expanding outward, pulling her in, pulling her closer to the cold, clammy hands that waited. And then the cold hands touched her. Story number 6. The Shadow at Noon. David Granger had never been particularly superstitious. Life had always been something he could understand, neat, ordered, predictable. He worked a steady job as a librarian, had a modest apartment in the city, and his routine was as fixed as the ticking of the clock on his wall. But it was a Thursday afternoon in early spring when everything began to change. David had just returned from his lunch break, the sun still high and bright in the sky. He lived on the top floor of a 10-story building, and the apartment had a small balcony that faced west, giving him an unobstructed view of the city skyline. As he walked through the living room, a peculiar thing caught his eye, his shadow. It was standing there, stretched long on the floor, but it was wrong. At first, it seemed like just another quirk of the afternoon sunlight, casting sharp angles on the walls and floor. His shadow, he thought, must have been affected by the angle of the sun, a trick of the light. But then he noticed something unsettling. His shadow was moving on its own, independent of his actions. It began to twitch and shift just slightly, as though it had a life of its own. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. He lifted his hand to his face, watching the shadow mimic his movements exactly. But when he lowered his hand, the shadow lingered for a moment longer, then slowly twisted to the left, opposite of his own motion. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. Shaking his head, David told himself it was just an illusion, a trick of the light. Shadows could play strange games with the mind, he reasoned. Yet, despite his logical mind, the strange feeling of unease gnawed at him. That night, as he lay in bed, trying to sleep, he kept thinking about it. His shadow, moving on its own. Was it just his imagination, or was there something more to it? The next day, he watched more closely. At precisely noon, as the sun hung directly overhead, David stood in the living room and stared at the floor, waiting for it to happen again. And there it was, his shadow, once again, behaving oddly. This time, it didn't just move. It seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen current. It stretched in unnatural directions, making sudden jerks as though it were trying to break free from him. David's heart raced. He stepped back, but the shadow continued to twitch and sway. "What the hell is happening?" David muttered to himself, his voice shaky. Over the following days, the phenomenon continued, each time more pronounced. At noon, the shadow became more aggressive, pulling away from David, inching closer to the walls, its form distorting like something trying to escape the floor beneath him. He began to feel a coldness in the room whenever it happened, a chill that ran down his spine, though there was no reason for it. It was as though the shadow was drawing energy from the air itself. By the end of the week, David's obsession had grown. He no longer saw the shadow as a mere curiosity. Every day, he would wait for noon with a sense of dread and anticipation, desperate to understand what was happening. Was it possible his shadow had developed some kind of sentience? Could it be alive? He tried to measure the moments when it moved, but there was no pattern. Sometimes it would stay still, sometimes it would twitch. Other times, it would almost seem to grow, stretching beyond the limits of its natural form. It was at this point that David noticed something truly horrifying. He had been keeping a journal, recording every instance of his shadow's behavior. But when he flipped back through the pages one evening, he found something strange. Certain entries were missing. Entries he was sure he had written. Days had disappeared from his memory, and entire sections of his life seemed to be erased. It wasn't just his journal. He began to notice gaps in his memory, things he couldn't recall clearly. Faces, names, conversations. Pieces of his past seemed to vanish into thin air, like the shadow itself was slowly erasing him. He would find himself staring at photos of friends, wondering who they were, as if they belonged to someone else. He would look in the mirror, and for a brief moment his reflection seemed wrong, as though someone else was standing there, wearing his face. David began to fear for his sanity. He consulted doctors, but they found nothing wrong with him. His blood pressure was normal. His heart was healthy. His mind, they assured him, was functioning perfectly. But the longer he lived with the shadow, the more distant and fractured he became from himself. On the following Monday, David did not wait until noon. He watched his shadow for hours, unable to tear his eyes away. When the clock finally struck 12, he held his breath, his entire body rigid with anticipation. The shadow began to twist again, but this time it was different. It reached out, not just on the floor, but upward, stretching toward him like it was trying to climb the walls to rise above him. David's stomach churned as he realized the truth. His shadow wasn't just moving independently anymore. It was trying to replace him. A panic gripped him. He tried to move, but his feet felt frozen to the floor, as though the shadow had rooted him to the ground. The shadow reached up toward his chest, and he could feel an icy grip on his heart. He gasped, trying to break free, but the more he struggled, the tighter it seemed to squeeze. David fell to his knees, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with terror. It wasn't just his shadow anymore. It was taking over his body, erasing him from existence. He screamed, but no sound escaped his mouth. The shadow covered him, engulfing him, as if it were swallowing him whole. And then, just as the darkness closed in around him, there was nothing. No scream, no panic, no time. David Granger's name would be erased from the records, forgotten by those who had once known him. The only trace left would be a shadow, standing in his place, waiting for the next noon. And as the clock struck 12, the shadow shifted again. Story number 7. The Keeper of Secrets. Victor Holloway had always been content in the quiet solitude of his library. An unassuming man in his mid-50s, he had spent the better part of his life among the shelves of old books, each volume a small treasure to be preserved and studied. The world outside had never interested him much. He preferred the silence of the library, the scent of aged paper, and the comforting rustle of pages as they turned. It was a life without drama, without complications, until the book found him. It had arrived on a Thursday, a dull and overcast day when the clouds hung heavy in the sky. The parcel was unexpected, wrapped in old, faded brown paper. The return address was unfamiliar to him. No name, no town, just a postmark from a distant, forgotten place. Inside the package was a single book, its cover made of strange, dark leather that shimmered in a way that felt almost unnatural. There were no titles or markings, only a faint, pulsating glow beneath the surface. Victor's curiosity piqued. He set the book on his desk and examined it, feeling the cool weight of it in his hands. As he traced his fingers across the cover, something stirred within him. It was as if the book had been waiting for him, as if it had always belonged here, in his care. The air seemed to grow heavier around him, a subtle pressure that he couldn't quite place. Ignoring the sense of unease building in his chest, Victor opened the book to the first page. The ink was faint, nearly invisible in the dim light of his study, but as he focused, the words began to reveal themselves, written in a language he did not recognize. Yet, somehow, he could understand it, as if the very act of reading had unlocked a part of his mind that had long been dormant. His eyes grew wide with fascination as the words flowed into his consciousness. The universe is a great illusion, a reflection of a far darker reality. All that you see, all that you know, is but a shadow of what truly exists. The truths hidden within the fabric of time and space are far more terrible than you could ever imagine, and there is a price to knowing them. The words were unsettling, but they beckoned him further. He could feel the pull of the book deep within him, as if it were whispering directly to his soul. The more he read, the deeper he sank into its mysteries. The writing spoke of ancient knowledge that had been buried by those who had come before him, knowledge that was too powerful for any man to possess. Victor felt his mind stretch, his thoughts expanding in ways he had never thought possible. The book seemed to reach into him, unearthing long-forgotten memories, dark corners of his psyche that he had never dared to explore. He read about the ancient beings that had shaped the universe, creatures of unimaginable power who existed beyond the veil of time, watching over everything from the shadows. He read about the great cosmic sacrifice that had been made to keep the balance of reality intact. And he read about the cost of knowing these secrets, the slow, inevitable unraveling of one's humanity. By the time he reached the book's third chapter, something inside him had shifted. The lines between his thoughts and the book's words blurred. The knowledge it contained was no longer just information. It was something far darker, far more insidious. The truths he uncovered began to chip away at his very sense of self. The world outside the library seemed distant, irrelevant. He could hear the whispers of the book in his mind, urging him forward. "It is your turn, Victor Holloway. The sacrifice must be made. You must become the keeper of these secrets. It is your destiny. But know this: the price is steep, and once you begin, there is no turning back." Victor's pulse quickened. He couldn't stop reading. He couldn't pull himself away. He felt the weight of the book's knowledge pressing down on him, its tendrils creeping into his soul. It was no longer just words on a page. It was a living thing, wrapping around him, binding him to the ancient forces it spoke of. The deeper he delved, the more he began to understand the terrible truth. Knowledge like this came with a price that would change him forever. As the days passed, Victor grew increasingly obsessed with the book. He read for hours on end, his meals forgotten, his sleep non-existent. His once immaculate library began to feel like a tomb, the air thick with an oppressive energy. He could feel the eyes of unseen beings watching him, listening to his every thought. The walls of the library seemed to close in on him, the shelves bending and warping under the weight of the book's secrets. And then, one night, as the clock struck midnight, Victor reached the final page. The last entry was different from the others. It wasn't written in the strange language he had come to understand. It was written in his own hand, as if the book had somehow taken control of him. The keeper of secrets must always remain hidden. The knowledge you now possess is far too dangerous for the world. You are the last one left, Victor. The sacrifice has been made. You are now the guardian of the truth, bound by the words of the Ancient Ones. And you will live for as long as you can keep it from spreading. But beware, the moment the truth escapes, the world will crumble. The secret is already starting to leak from you. And once it does, it will be too late for anyone. Victor's heart pounded in his chest. His vision blurred, his thoughts spinning. The book had done something to him, changed him in ways he couldn't understand. The knowledge it had given him was overwhelming, a burden that now threatened to consume him completely. And then, as if to prove the book's final warning true, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. Victor turned, his breath caught in his throat. The shadow twisted, forming a shape, something tall, something ancient. It was the figure from the book, a being of dark energy, its form flickering like a flame. It spoke, but the words were not in a language he could understand. They were ancient, primal, and as it spoke, Victor felt something deep within him begin to break. The truth, the terrible knowledge he had gained, was starting to seep out, and there was no way to stop it. Victor's body trembled, his vision fading as the weight of the secret threatened to crush him. The price had been paid, and there was no going back. The keeper of secrets had become a prisoner to them. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the shadow stretching across the floor, reaching toward the book on the desk. And then, everything went silent. The world would never be the same again. Story number 8, Winter's End. The town of Pine Hollow had always been a place where time moved slowly, a quiet speck of civilization nestled in the remote northern hills. The winters were harsh, yes, but the people were used to it. They had endured the bitter cold for generations, always banding together to weather the storms. But that winter, the winter of 1978, was different. Something was wrong. The cold felt deeper, sharper, like it was seeping into their bones, not just their skin. And it wasn't just the weather. It started with the trees. At first, It was subtle. The tall pines lining the road to town began to bend unnaturally, their branches reaching down toward the ground. People thought it was just the weight of snow or the frost playing tricks on their eyes. But by the end of the first week, the branches hadn't just sagged, they had grown, twisting, curling, stretching as if the trees were trying to escape the earth itself. Caleb Barton, a schoolteacher in his late 30s, had always loved the outdoors. He enjoyed the tranquility of the woods surrounding Pine Hollow and often took long walks to clear his mind. But on his usual route, one frigid afternoon, he noticed something disturbing. The trees weren't just bending, they were twisting, as though they had minds of their own. Their trunks seemed to warp and split, stretching toward the horizon like living things. The once familiar forest looked alien and wrong. By the time Caleb made it back to town, something had changed in the air. People were acting strange, nervous, twitchy, like they were on edge. It wasn't just the town's old folk either. He saw Carl Mitchell, the butcher, looking at his hands with wide, fearful eyes, as though he didn't recognize them. "I don't know what's happening," Carl mumbled, clutching his fingers as if they might break off at any moment. When Caleb asked his neighbor, Mrs. Elsie Mayfield, if she'd noticed anything odd, she looked at him with dark eyes, her face pale. "You can't be too careful with the cold, Caleb," she said, almost too quietly. "Some things, they change when the frost gets deep enough." The following day, Caleb saw what she meant. The animals, once peaceful and predictable, had turned erratic. The squirrels that usually scurried through the trees had grown unnaturally large, their eyes bulging, their movements jerky and unnatural. The birds were worse. Flocks of them swooped overhead, but they no longer sang. Instead, their calls were harsh, distorted, like screams echoing through the trees. And the dogs, even the ones that had always been friendly, barked at nothing, their fur standing on end, eyes wild and unblinking. But it wasn't just the animals. That evening, as Caleb walked into the local diner, he froze at the sight of the townspeople. They had gathered together, but something was off. Their faces were pale, their eyes glazed over, like they weren't really there. Old Henry Miller, the town's longest-serving mechanic, had a strange twitch to his mouth. He was muttering to himself, words Caleb couldn't make out. He turned to the woman next to him, but when his eyes met hers, they were no longer the eyes of the man Caleb had known for years. They were dark, unblinking, and seemed to be staring right through him. Something was happening to them. Something that was seeping into their bodies, twisting them. Caleb had to know what was going on. But every time he tried to ask, no one would answer, as if they couldn't speak or didn't want to. Even his own thoughts felt clouded, as though his mind were becoming foggy, like the frost itself was creeping into his brain. The chill in the air seemed to be invading his skin, but he had no choice. He had to find the cause before it overtook everything. He went to the local library, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. The library was old, full of dusty shelves and forgotten books. As he searched, the temperature dropped further, and a strange unease settled over him. Then he found it. A worn, leather-bound book tucked away in a far corner. The title was faded, almost illegible, but Caleb pulled it down, heart pounding in his chest. The book spoke of ancient forces, unnatural growth, the kind that could consume a town, a place, a people. It described how, in times of great cold, a power would awaken in the earth itself, a force that could cause plants to grow wildly, animals to behave erratically, and people to undergo horrifying transformations. The text was old, older than anything Caleb had ever read, and it hinted at something even darker. Those who were touched by the cold would become vessels for something ancient and primal. As Caleb read, the pieces fell into place. The trees, the animals, the people. Everything was being twisted by this power, this force that had been buried beneath the earth for centuries. It wasn't the cold itself that was the cause. It was something that had awakened with the frost, something that had been dormant beneath the town for generations. The town of Pine Hollow was sitting atop an ancient burial ground, and the frost had awoken whatever lay hidden there. Caleb had only one choice: to stop it before it consumed them all. He ran back to the center of town, but when he arrived, it was too late. The streets were empty, the air thick with a strange, unnatural fog. The town square was frozen, and the buildings seemed to be sinking into the earth itself, their foundations twisting and cracking like roots taking hold. Then he saw them. The townspeople were no longer human. Their forms had twisted into grotesque shapes, their limbs unnaturally elongated, their faces covered in moss and bark, their eyes glowing with a strange, unearthly light. They moved slowly, as if they were part of the earth now, their bodies rooted to the ground, shifting like the trees themselves. They had become vessels for the ancient force, lost to it, just as the animals had become. Caleb tried to scream, but the sound was caught in his throat. His body trembled from the cold, and he could feel the frost crawling under his skin. He knew then that the transformation was inevitable, that the cold would claim him too, just as it had claimed them all. The wind howled through the streets, and the trees groaned as they twisted in unnatural ways. The town of Pine Hollow was no more. It had become a part of the earth, a place where the old forces had awakened and claimed their due. And as Caleb's body began to stiffen, as the frost took hold of him, he could hear the wind whispering the names of those who had come before him, those who had become the earth. The winter had come, and with it, the end. Story number 9. The Harrowing of Jacob Black. Jacob Black had never been a religious man, nor particularly superstitious. He was a man of logic, a man who believed in facts, in the black and white nature of the world around him. But that belief, that calm certainty, had been shattered the day his wife, Emily, died. It was a rainy Thursday when the call came. Jacob had been at work, sorting through papers at his desk when the phone rang, its shrill tone piercing through the stillness of the office. His heart had dropped the moment he heard the voice on the other end. Emily had been in a car accident. They told him it was a head-on collision, that the impact had been severe, that she didn't survive. Jacob hadn't even made it to the hospital in time. The doctors had already pronounced her dead by the time he arrived. He couldn't even hold her hand in those final moments. It wasn't supposed to end like that. Not so suddenly, not so violently. He had been angry at first, angry at the world, angry at the driver who had hit her, angry at himself for not being there when she needed him. But as the days wore on, that anger turned inward. Guilt began to seep into his mind. It festered, spreading like a sickness. Emily had always been the more spontaneous one, the one who loved to take risks, who lived for adventure. Jacob had always been the cautious one, the one who would have rather stayed home on a quiet evening than go out to some far-off place. He had often told her that her reckless spirit would get her hurt one day. How many times had he warned her? How many times had he said, "Be careful, Emily, don't push your luck"? Now she was gone, and all he could think about was how much he had resented her free spirit, how much he had wanted her to slow down, to be more like him. The guilt was unbearable. It started subtly at first, the feeling that someone was watching him. A soft breeze that stirred the curtains when the windows were closed. The faintest echo of her voice, calling his name in the middle of the night. He had chalked it up to grief. He'd heard that it was common for people to feel the presence of a loved one after they had passed. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks, his heart longing for her so much that it created illusions. But it didn't stop, it grew. Every night as Jacob lay in bed, he would feel the weight of something pressing against him, something cold and heavy, like an invisible hand resting on his chest. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, certain that she was there, standing in the shadows just beyond the edge of the room. Her presence was growing, and with it, something darker. One evening, after another restless night, Jacob stood in the middle of their bedroom, staring at the empty space beside him, where she used to lie. The room was colder than it had ever been, and as he stepped forward, the air seemed to thicken, suffocating him. A chill ran down his spine, and then he heard it, the unmistakable whisper of her voice, soft and broken. Jacob. He spun around, his heart racing. The room was empty, as it always was, but her voice lingered in the air, hanging like a weight, choking the life from the room. Jacob. You didn't save me. You could have saved me. Her voice was soft at first, but it was growing louder, more insistent, filled with an unnatural bitterness. Her words pierced through him, each one a dagger to his heart. He staggered back, his chest tightening, unable to breathe. Please, he gasped, choking on the words. Please, Emily, don't do this. I never wanted this. But the voice didn't stop. It only grew stronger, more anguished. You killed me, Jacob, she said. You killed me by standing there, doing nothing. It was then that Jacob realized this wasn't just grief. This wasn't just some manifestation of his own tortured soul. It was her. Emily was here and she was angry, consumed by something darker than sorrow. She had come back to torment him, to make him pay for the sins of his past, for the words he had said, for the things he had kept hidden deep inside. His guilt was no longer a burden, it was a curse, and Emily was the instrument of its execution. As the days passed, her presence grew more malevolent. Objects would move on their own. Small things at first. A picture frame falling from the mantel, a glass of water tipping over on the table. But it escalated. The lights flickered, doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. Her whispers turned to shrieks, each one more violent, more hateful. The final night came like a storm. Jacob awoke to find the house plunged into darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps as he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the hallway. He tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't obey. The air felt thick, like it was closing in around him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. In the doorway stood Emily, but she was no longer the woman he had loved. Her once beautiful face was twisted in a horrific snarl, her eyes black as coal, filled with an unnatural rage. Her skin was pale, her mouth stretched wide into a twisted grin. "You're going to pay for what you did," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. Jacob's mind began to unravel. He had always thought of himself as a man of reason, a man who could confront any problem with logic. But logic had no place here. There was no explanation for what was happening, no solution he could find. His guilt had summoned her, had given her power over him, and now she was taking everything from him, piece by piece. She advanced toward him, her hands outstretched. "I'm going to make you feel the pain I felt," she said, her voice now a low growl. The last thing Jacob saw before the darkness swallowed him whole were those eyes, black and empty, staring back at him, accusing him. The next morning, the house was silent. The town whispered about the strange, tragic death of Jacob Black, but no one truly knew what had happened inside that house. The only thing that remained was the emptiness, the stillness of the room, and the faint echo of Emily's voice, forever lingering in the corners of Jacob's mind, Story number 10. The Hollow Child. The town of Ashford had always been quiet, isolated from the world beyond by miles of thick forest and winding roads. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where life moved slowly and predictably, like the steady rhythm of the river that ran through the heart of it. But that changed when Anna Stevenson's son, Charlie, returned home. Anna had gone to the city for months, leaving her son with her sister, a precautionary measure that now seemed more like an omen. When she returned to Ashford, she found Charlie different. Strange, distant. He no longer ran to greet her with the same joy he once had. His eyes, once wide and full of innocence, were cold, empty, as if they were looking through her rather than at her. At first, she dismissed it. It was only the effects of being away from home, she told herself. But then, she started to notice more. Small things. The way Charlie would sit alone in his room for hours, staring out the window with an unnatural stillness. The way he spoke, or rather, the way he didn't speak. He would answer questions, but his responses were flat, devoid of the usual warmth or curiosity a child should have. Anna tried to shake off her growing concern, but there was something about Charlie's silence that was haunting. He didn't laugh, he didn't cry, he didn't get angry, and he didn't love. He simply existed. It was at the town's annual summer fair that things started to take a darker turn. The festival had always been a joyous occasion, a chance for the people of Ashford to come together. But that year, as Anna watched Charlie from the corner of her eye, she felt an unease creeping into her bones. Charlie stood motionless near the old wooden carousel, his pale face illuminated by the flickering lights. The other children played and laughed around him, but Charlie didn't even blink. He didn't watch them. He just stared at the rotating horses, his gaze fixed and unblinking. Anna approached him, calling his name softly, but he didn't react. It was as if she wasn't there at all. "Charlie," she said again, her voice trembling. "Come on, let's go home." The boy's head snapped toward her so suddenly that Anna felt a chill run down her spine. His eyes were wide, but there was nothing behind them. No recognition, no joy, no fear, just emptiness. "Mother," he said, his voice soft and hollow, like an echo in a cavern. "I am not your son." The words hit her like a slap to the face. Anna froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Charlie was still staring at her, but it wasn't the boy she had raised. This wasn't her son. This was something else. Something that had worn his face, that had walked in his skin. But it wasn't him, it couldn't be. Fear clutched at her throat, but she couldn't tear herself away from those cold, lifeless eyes. Then, as if the spell had been broken, Charlie blinked and the blankness faded, replaced by a small, confused smile. "What's wrong, Mama?" he asked, his voice returning to its usual pitch as if nothing had happened. Anna, shaken to her core, didn't know what to think. She tried to convince herself that it was just the stress of being away, the months apart, but deep down, she knew. Something was terribly wrong. Over the following weeks, the town grew uneasy. Anna wasn't the only one to notice the change in Charlie. People began to whisper. Old Mr. Harris, the grocer, said he saw Charlie in the woods late one night, standing still in the dark, staring at the trees, his face expressionless. Sarah, the schoolteacher, claimed she had caught Charlie staring at her during class, his gaze unblinking, while the other children laughed and played. No one could explain it. People tried to avoid him, and the more they tried, the more isolated Charlie became. The whispers turned to fears, and the fears turned to suspicion. It was Maureen, the town's oldest resident, who finally spoke of the unspoken truth that had been haunting the town for generations. "It's the old ways," she whispered one evening, sitting with Anna on the porch of her house. the rituals of the forest, the ones we don't speak of. Anna had heard the stories, of course, tales of the strange old customs that had once been practiced in Ashford, of ancient rites that had been lost to time. But no one believed them anymore. They were just stories, old wives' tales, or so she thought. Maureen's eyes were shadowed with something darker as she leaned closer. There's something that lives in these woods, Anna, something ancient. It doesn't want a soul. It takes them, leaves the body behind, and the child becomes hollow. It's not just Charlie, you know. He's the one they chose. Anna didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Was this madness? Or was Maureen telling the truth? Either way, something had to be done. That night, driven by a desperate need to protect her son, Anna ventured into the woods. It was late, far too late for a mother to be out in the darkness, but the fear that gripped her heart was all-consuming. She had to know the truth. The deeper she walked, the colder it became, the air thick with something oppressive, something that whispered through the trees. She came to the clearing where she had once played as a child, and there, in the center, she saw it. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing still. Before she could speak, the figure turned. It was Charlie's face, but not Charlie. The eyes were the same, empty, hollow, devoid of life. The creature that stood before her was no longer her son. It was something older, something far more terrifying. "You should have let me be, Anna," the thing said in a voice that was not Charlie's, yet somehow still carried his essence. "Now, you will join us, forever." Anna's scream echoed through the woods as the thing reached out to her, its fingers long and cold, like the very roots of the earth itself. She tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She could feel something pulling her, dragging her toward the void. And then, just as she was about to give in, a flash of light, Charlie's voice, cut through the darkness. "Mama, don't leave me," he cried, his voice returning to the boy she once knew. Anna woke up on the ground, the sun just beginning to rise, her heart pounding in her chest. She was alone, but the air still felt wrong. Her son, her beloved Charlie, was nowhere to be found. The town of Ashford was still, the streets empty, the woods silent. But Anna knew whatever was in those woods had taken her son, and the hollow child that remained would never be the same.